is to give you an idea of what is possible and that you can get to the various levels. Think about how far you've come with your photography overall. And it's because you see examples of new work and the types of things that are very interesting. And that's what leads to better photography. So I think keep that in mind as we go forward, that I'm showing you very basic level and then on up, 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 up. And if you see these, you will then think about those types of work, that type of work, as you're out photographing. So let's start with beginning level flowers. And with beginning level flowers, you have cluttered backgrounds, not appropriate depth of field. You're just learning, maybe even just shooting on automatic. And when you look at a flower up close, you see all the detail through the petals, and it's just so beautiful. And then when you photograph it, you think you have it, but if you look closely, you'll see that the depth of field wasn't sharp all the way through. And there's a new feature came out a year or so ago in Photoshop called focus stacking, which allows you to take multiple shots at different focus points and then puts them all together, and you can get sharp all the way through a flower. It's just sharpness everywhere. It's really beautiful. Often you need cropping because you photograph too much and you need to focus only on the flower or some aspect of the flower. And you'll see that as we progress through the more sophisticated photography. And often in the early stages, we lack instant impact. And the reason we don't have instant impact is because we see the flower and it's so beautiful, and we think as we shoot it, that is how it's going to appear on the screen, but it isn't. So let me give you some examples. Here's a shot of a basket sitting out on the lawn, and oh, look at those flowers, those roses, oh, it's so beautiful. Now look at the top of the image, and you see there's a lot of space all the way around. So beginning level, you see this, and you oh, just the beauty, but you see the lower right portion, it's lost detail, it's fuzzy, blurred. The background is a little bit cluttered, bright highlights in some areas, but you don't see that when you're photographing it at your first level of flowers. You just see the beauty of the flower and you take the shot. And this is interesting image, and the colors are very neat, but you need some cropping. All the space on the right is just too much space. When that image hits the screen, what is the viewer seeing? Your mind saw that flower. You focused, literally focused on the flower with your camera and with your mind, and didn't think about all the additional space around it, which takes away from what the flower is. Think about what percent of this image represents the flower, probably 25%. And even if you split this in half and remove the right half, you would have a much better image of the flower. Looking right into the flower, yet look at the lower right corner, which when you are first photographing, you don't even see the things around it. And often I will say to somebody, no matter what photography you're doing, once you see what you want as your main point or your main emphasis, then stop looking at that in your viewfinder or on the back of your camera and look all around the rest of the image to see if your cropping is the way you want. Now, certainly you can crop later, so think about that. And you may want to crop later, but you may want to take multiple shots. That portion of this image in the lower right is distracting. In fact, it's brighter than what the center of the main flower is. And then up in the upper left corner, that open and all the deep busyness in the background. So this is stage one. We're just learning to do photography. Actually, the flower has somewhat of a good depth of field, but not entirely. You see the foreground piece is in focus, and then it fades off to the back and is blurred.
No, just wanted to know if you want to have to.
We get to this level, and the flower itself is very pretty, but all that in the background is very distracting. Again, the person is focusing, literally focusing and camera-wise on that flower in the center without thinking about all that's behind it. So you have the distracting other flowers and in the lower right corner, that colored flower taking away from the main flower. Well, here's something really interesting. You key right in onto the center of this flower. That's very pretty. But you see the bud coming out from the right and then coming up, and then in the upper right-hand corner, whoever the photographer was didn't even see that. They were seeing only the middle of that flower, the beauty of the color in there. And even this one has a fairly good depth of field on it, because even the buds in the background have, on the left, have a little bit of sharpness to them, but all around in the upper left areas takes away, and that very bright area on the left side takes away from the main subject. Ah, yes, reflections. Oh, those reflections are so beautiful. And here comes a dragonfly. I'll bet you didn't even see the dragonfly when I first put this up, but I think that's the message the person wanted to bring across, because here comes this dragonfly and it's so small, but here's this beautiful reflection. Well, you're not going to get both a larger dragonfly and the reflection of the flower. And again, the right-hand side of this image really doesn't bring essence to the main flower and the reflection. The main flower is sharp, looks good, but the background behind the flower is about the same light intensity as the pads on the water. Ah, come in closer now. Depth of field, much better. But look at this on the right-hand side, and the upper left background takes away from the image. Once you see the flower, you start, your eye starts roaming around, and you're now not really coming back to the flower. Ah, but this one, you see more in there until you realize that there's a bright green area on the right, but the focus is fairly decent. You're losing depth of field in the left side of the flower, and a little bit more of the foreground petal, or the petal coming out towards us, is very fuzzy, blurred. Now we get to a reflection that brings your eye right to the reflection, except for the one on the right. And if this person had cropped that right-hand side so that the center of attention was truly the center of the image. In fact, this could be a vertical rather than a horizontal and still keep the reflection. Now we come in closer. Background to the upper part of the image is very good. It allows the flower to be more three-dimensional. When you have light against dark, it becomes more three-dimensional. So again, stop looking at what your main point of photograph, and then look around in the background. In this case, just moving down a little lower and having more of the darker area behind it would have made this great. But depth of field is an issue. And this is where focus stacking would work really well. So often in my early days of photography, I thought, oh, I need a macro lens. Oh, a macro lens. And I got a macro lens. Well, the problem with a macro lens, it has a very shallow depth of field. And usually a macro lens is used for very fine details, say the internals of a watch or something, but we use it on a flower, and then the depth of field is even shallower than shooting this with a telephoto lens with a f/22 and getting the whole flower in focus. Much better, much more impact, starting to tell a story about what do you want the viewer to see, but the highlights to the left and the lower right, and that's fine to have a whole area of lightness around the flower, but it isn't the same as in the upper right area. So the whole balance of highlights and tones is very important when you are showing the flower. And here we're starting to get a little bit more detail, a little more depth of field, which is very good. Single subject, beautiful background. Placement of the flower is very nice, but you get the blowout. So many times, look at the histogram and see if the highlights are blown out. It tells you instantly. This could have been shot at a lower ISO, or increase the aperture, which would give you even better depth of field, or even understand about reducing the highlight that's hitting the flower. So lots of things to think about of the light. Is it soft light? And so often when I was first shooting flowers, I thought the best time to shoot a flower was when the sun was right on the flower. Absolute wrong time to shoot a flower, because you have too much of a contrast to the highlights and the shadows. A soft light is beautiful when you get good depth of field, and you get good ideas of what is in the shadow area, what is in the highlight, the brighter area, and you get detail in those areas. Now we're getting to where the flower is the message and what we want the viewer to see. A little bit of distraction in the upper left corner, but overall, the background is good relating to the flower. Depth of field is a little bit of an issue here. So now as you're progressing through shooting flowers, you're looking at how the flower will be presented. What is the main aspect of the flower, the central part of this flower, but still the cropping. Crop off in the right, crop off in the left, darken that background just a little bit. Also, an early stage, we think, oh, let's just present it in a very artistic way, and we'll sort of blur certain aspects, and that's wonderful. But here we have two flowers, and the general rule is you should have an odd number of items, because with two, you go from the left to the right, back again to the left, then back to the right. And the presentation of this flower, if it had been just the one on the left, would be somewhat artistic. So now we get a little bit more detail. Close, get close, but no cigar. And I wonder how many people would remember that expression from carnivals. If you got close, but no cigar, you didn't get the cigar. So better backgrounds, better depth of field, certainly better composition now. And it still may need some cropping. Many times, early stage and intermediate stage photography, cropping doesn't seem to be something they think about when they're out shooting. And I don't mean that you should crop it in the camera. Allow yourself to have some additional room around the image, crop later, but think about the cropping in relation to how does it affect the message. And in this case, we're getting to where the images will have some impact. So think about the ones we just saw that were early stage. Now let's look at those that are getting closer. Tells a story, shows something happening. Still, there's a lot of empty space. So let's zoom in. Let's play with the idea of some area being out of focus and the center being focused. But you see, it's a single presentation. So we're now moved up from the early stage to being a little bit more creative, a little bit more artistic about presenting a flower. Even more so on this one. And in fact, this one, though, to me, gets to be too confusing, because there isn't, for me, a single point of interest. This has a single point of interest. I think now that the sun could have been less bright in the sense of cutting down the exposure, being on a tripod and allowing the shutter speed to be long enough to capture what you need, but that bright area is just too bright. But the idea is starting to really get there with the idea of creating this flower and the light behind it and the simple, overall simple background, so that as soon as this image hits the screen, there isn't any confusion of the subject. That is the subject. We're getting closer, no cigar. A little bit too much space on the left-hand side and certainly on the upper part. If you just hold your hand over the screen and block off the upper part of the image, just close down to the flower or the main subject, and a little bit off the left, you'll see how much more impact that would have. So we're getting closer, closer, and even having the bee and the wings are out. Well done. We have a little bit too much light area in the upper right corner, and certainly in the upper left corner where that highlight is there, and in the lower left corner, taking away from the center of interest, the flower itself, and a little bit of a drop off in sharpness. And you think, John, you're really being tough here. Well, wait till we get to some of the other levels and you'll see what I'm talking about. Good presentation. Here it is. When it hits the screen, your eye goes right into the center of that flower. Now we have this little blue area in the background on the right. We have the bud folded over in the lower right area, a little too much empty space on the left, but boy, we're getting there close, but no, not the cigar yet, but close. This flower in the lower left area of this image. Very pretty, good presentation. But what's this in the upper right area? We don't need that in there at all. That lower left third, or crop the image to the, crop off the right, crop off a little of the top, hold your hands on the screen and crop off the top of this image of that main flower and crop off the flower on the right, and you'll see how much more impact that has. We're getting closer. The background's not as distracting overall. Now the background is well done. The bee is very sharp, but we've lost detail in the flower itself because they are concentrating only on the bee. Started telling a story. We're getting close, started to tell the story. Simple. Here it is. When the image hits the screen there, you can't see anything else but what the photographer wants you to see. Well done with the dragonfly. Beautiful water droplets on its wings and the flower. But what is this hanging down in a simple background? Very well done. The yellow flower area against the blue complementary colors stands out. Lighter area against the dark area. Very well done. All of this hanging down, very distracting. Could have come out of there very easily. Either take it out at the time for couldn't do it while the dragonfly is sitting there, but if this is where you thought the dragonfly was flying around, then take those out or clone them out later. Would have been almost there. The flower itself presented wonderfully. And I couldn't understand why they would have all of this black area. I understand doing a long horizontal image, but it's way too much. That flower represents maybe 30% of the total presentation. But boy, starting to get there on how that stands out three-dimensionally from that black background, and how the flower itself is very well proportioned and stands out. Almost there. The flower is looking good. The depth of field isn't great, but it's close. A little bit too much background and way too light in the background. You think, oh yes, John, when your eye hits this image at first, you are seeing from a little bit above the middle on down to the bottom part. You ignore that part of this image that's in the upper portion. That shouldn't be in there because the image itself is that lower 2/3 of the image. Well done, well presented. A little bit more depth of field could be on that flower in the lower left. And you say, John, now you're getting really picky. Well, hold on till we get to the wow, wow, wow stage and you'll see what is going on. But this is, you're getting to the stage of really seeing how all these interact. And look at the difference of the highlight. The highlight on the flower in the lower left, a little darker in the flower to the upper right to it, and the one directly to the right of it. The three flowers have different light and shadows on them. And if some of the other areas had been cropped in, be starting to get there, close, close. Very artistic, simple background. Works in relation to the presentation itself, slightly on an angle, well done. But all that in the right-hand side takes away. It's too much space. You're not allowing you're not forcing the viewer to see exactly what you want them to see and not roam around. Good presentation. Now there isn't anything distracting, nothing in the background, nothing to take you away, not some other flower anywhere. Maybe down there in the lower right, you see that little bit of color down there. You say, oh, John, now you're getting really picky. Well, I am getting picky so that you can learn and get to the level of what you'll see shortly. The problem with this one is the depth of field. There is actually nothing sharp throughout the whole flower, but the overall concept of here it is, when it hits the screen, you cannot have any idea other than what the photographer wants you to see. Certainly this one, you see it, the sharpness in the center of the flower, even the petals laying out and so pretty and so on. But that upper left, the lower left, overlapping with the flower itself. See how the right-hand side, the darker area, allows that flower to stand out, more three-dimensional. And then over in this left-hand side, it sort of all merges together. Close, but no cigar. So now we're getting there. Simple, good presentation, a little bit, and maybe not so good that there are two elements, but my mind and my eye doesn't bounce back too much on this, but the most important part that isn't working is the area of bright light in the flower that's all blown out, no detail. But the presentation, the reflection, everything, the long horizontal with some elements in it, now it's starting to really come together.
John, what about all the stuff on the lily pad, on the pad itself?
Yes, well, that's a matter of preference. And in my case, I would not have wanted all that in there, but in fact, I would have concentrated probably just on the flower. But the whole idea of the presentation and having the elements of the image stand out is what struck me at first.
John, one extra thing too. How about on the flower? It just kind of looks like it's hanging in space. It doesn't.
Yes, it does. So you're not seeing the water itself. So that's now an issue or an item. It's not an issue, it's an item of how do you want to present it? This comes across more to me as just an artistic presentation more than the realism of the flowers and the flower and the water. And the presentation artistically of having that pad there creates sort of a painting, almost, not quite. You're getting there.
It's almost like there's three elements, with the reflection being its own elements.
Yes, that's right.
The reflection to the pad.
That's right. It does.
John, if I may, this picture, and I think several of the others you showed, would have benefited from your favorite four-letter word, flip. The lily pad would have been a good introduction to the picture.
Yes.
The bright yellow flower on the right is where your eye gets directed and stopped. It's such a brilliant object against the background. I think this and a few others would benefit from flipping.
Yes, indeed it would, no doubt. And I was tempted to do it, and I thought I say it too often, and people now kid me about it. I can't tell you how many times they call me John Flip.
Favorite four-letter word? Ooh,
Good presentation. The flowers in the log, and you can see how the upper left is darker and the lower right is lighter, which brings you in, and the shape of the tree itself, and then the color of the flowers, and you see the darkness behind them, and the color of the flowers are well done, the sharpness throughout. This is really getting there. Very nicely done. Very creative. Almost getting there, but same issues. In fact, I could have had this in Close But No Cigar. The flower in the bottom part just takes away from the main flower, and that on the left-hand side is distracting. Now we're doing very creative. Wow, the background, the greens, all working within the flower and so on. And it thought, come on, why did you cut it off on the right? And I thought, well, let's try flipping it and see if that works a little better. But it works maybe. I still think this one works well because your eye's coming in from the left and coming up to the flower. But the flower being cut off like that just doesn't make it. And I think the photographer truly was, I use the word focusing again, on the insect more than the overall presentation. But the curves working really nicely in here, and the colors of the background in relation to the stem going up on the left, all of that works really well. Just, wow, just a little bit more. And I don't recommend cropping. I say crop. I mean after the fact. Don't crop so tightly in your camera. Allow yourself to have the freedom to crop it appropriately afterwards, or take a couple shots. And the reason I say don't crop it in your camera is because our cameras today have such great pixels. And to think that you need to be cropping it just the way you're going to show it, you're losing pixels that you might want. So either take a little wider, crop later, or take multiple shots. One with a larger portion of the image and one with less, and then you can decide later which way you want to use it. This doesn't work flipped, but I just wanted to see how it would look. And in fact, flipped like this, you tend to see the insect and your eye spends more time on the right, and you don't notice as much as the flower is cropped. Now we have wonderful presentation, good color background in relation to the color of the main subject. In fact, Sally, I would say you take this same similar kind of look and take it to the extreme in a wonderful way. You do such wonderful things with the backgrounds and matching the colors and things like that. This image would be much more powerful if it was cropped on the right and made this to a vertical rather than the way it is now. So here's a situation where photographed more, fine, then crop it. Just hold your hand on about a third or more of that right-hand side and see how that whole flow from the lower left on up in, and the brighter area on the flower itself with the insects, but that's much brighter than the rest of it. You key in on it even more. Same here, subtle background, flower presented really well. And you said, well, John, you were talking about sharpness throughout. Well, this presentation lends itself to not having the flower all around being as sharp, but the center is. And then the highlights, where the highlights are, and the highlights and the color right in the center. When this hits the screen, let me come back. When this hits the screen, there is no doubt where your eye goes, right to the center of that flower. Now, think about this in relation to those that I showed in the beginning and said, here's the early stage. Wow, you're just there. Keying in on the bee and the wings in a certain area, and the dark lines of the inner portion of the flower really in tight.